The moment I walked through the door of my supervisor's office and saw him sitting there, the same man I'd bought coffee for at the gas station 3 weeks earlier, I felt the floor tilt under my feet. He wasn't wearing the worn flannel jacket anymore. He was in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and the way he held himself in that chair told me everything I'd missed the first time around. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Rachel, and at the time of this story, I was 29 years old and working as a floor nurse at Mercy Valley Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. I'd been there for 4 years, long enough to know which vending machine still had the good granola bars on Tuesday mornings, long enough to know which attending physicians would actually listen to you and which ones would smile through you like you were made of glass, long enough to love the work in the way that only gets harder to explain the longer you do it. I worked the day shift on the cardiac step-down unit, which meant I came in at 6:45 every morning, gave myself 15 minutes to review my patients, and spent the next 12 hours doing approximately 9,000 things at once. It was the kind of work where you learned pretty quickly that you could either be organized or be overwhelmed. And I had chosen organized, color-coded notes, a laminated shift checklist I'd made myself, a system for everything. What I had not chosen and could not have anticipated was my new nurse manager. His name was Director Caldwell. He had transferred in from a larger hospital network in Philadelphia about 8 months before this story takes place, and from his first week at Mercy Valley, it was clear that he had come to make changes. That word, changes, had a particular weight the way he used it. It meant cutting. It meant streamlining. It meant a certain kind of cold efficiency that looked great in a quarterly report and felt on the ground like being slowly squeezed. He was not a bad person in the obvious way. He never yelled. He never said anything you could easily point to and call unfair. But there was a pattern that emerged over those months, quiet and consistent, the way water damage works. You don't notice it until the ceiling is already soft. He passed over my suggestions in team meetings without comment. He reassigned 2 of my most experienced patients to newer nurses who then struggled, which then reflected poorly on the unit's outcomes, which he then cited in his reports. When I submitted a proposal for a modified discharge checklist that 3 attending physicians had already praised, it sat in his inbox for 6 weeks. When a male colleague submitted something similar 2 weeks later, it was implemented within 10 days. I want to be careful here. I'm not someone who looks for grievances. I genuinely am not. I know that healthcare is complicated, that leadership is hard, and that sometimes things that look personal are just institutional. I held on to that possibility for a long time. But there's a difference between giving someone the benefit of the doubt and pretending not to see what's right in front of you. And what was right in front of me by about month 7 was that Director Caldwell had decided, for reasons I never fully understood, that I was a problem to be managed down. The most concrete thing he did, the thing I still think about, happened on a Thursday in February. We had a patient, a 72-year-old man named Mr. Okafor, who had come in with what looked like a routine exacerbation of his congestive heart failure. His numbers had been trending in a direction I didn't like for about 6 hours. Nothing dramatic. Just a quiet shift in his fluid balance and a slight change in the quality of his breathing that didn't match his oxygen numbers in the way I expected. I flagged it with the resident on call, who reviewed the chart and told me to continue monitoring. I continued monitoring. And then I called again an hour later because my gut, 4 years of 12-hour shifts, 4 years of learning to read the particular language a body uses when it starts to struggle. My gut was telling me something was being missed. The resident was annoyed. He told me the numbers were within acceptable range. He told me I was being overcautious. I called the attending. Mr. Okafor was in the ICU within 2 hours with a confirmed pulmonary embolism. The attending later told me that my second call had almost certainly changed the outcome. Director Caldwell called me into his office the following morning and told me that I had violated the chain of communication protocol by escalating without documented justification, and that a formal note would be placed in my personnel file. I sat in that chair across from his desk and kept my face very still and thought about all the things I could say, and I said none of them. I said, "I understand." And I walked back out to the floor and I went back to work because Mr. Okafor was still my patient and he still needed me. That was in February. The gas station was in March. It was a Saturday morning, my day off, and I had driven out to the east side of Columbus to visit a friend who had just had a baby. I stopped at a Shell station on the way back to fill up my tank and grab something to drink. It was early, maybe 8:15, the kind of morning where the air still has that particular cold clarity that makes everything look slightly more real than usual. There was an old man at the counter ahead of me. He was somewhere in his mid to late 70s, I would have guessed. White hair, neatly kept, wearing a plain dark jacket over a button-down shirt. He was buying a cup of coffee and a blueberry muffin, the cellophane-wrapped kind that sit in a wire rack by the register. He was pleasant with the cashier. Actually pleasant. The kind of pleasant that is not performed but just is. The way some older people have a natural ease with strangers that younger people have mostly forgotten how to do. He ran his card. The cashier looked at the screen and tried again. Then she looked up with the particular apologetic expression that cashiers develop for these moments. "I'm sorry, sir, it's coming up," declined. He patted his jacket pockets, then his pants pockets. His face did a small, quiet thing that I recognized. Not embarrassment exactly, more like the slight recalibration of a person who has just found themselves unexpectedly exposed in public in a way that doesn't match their internal sense of themselves. "I must have grabbed the wrong card," he said. He had the kind of voice that was steady without trying to be. "I apologize, I've got it," I said. I don't know exactly why I said it without hesitating. I think it was less a decision than a reflex. I had watched my mother do the same thing my whole childhood. Pay for the person behind her in the drive-thru, quietly cover the difference when she saw someone short at the grocery store. It was so embedded in how I understood kindness to work that it barely registered as a choice. I handed the cashier a 10 and told her to keep the change. The old man turned to look at me with an expression I can only describe as genuinely surprised. Not the polite surprise people perform when they're expecting to be helped. Actually surprised. "That's very kind of you," he said. "Thank you." "Of course," I said. "Have a good morning." And that was it. I got my water bottle and my granola bar. I drove back to my apartment, and I did not think about it again in any significant way. It was a cup of coffee and a blueberry muffin. It cost me $4 and some change. I was not doing it to be remembered. I was not doing it to be thanked. I was doing it because an older man was standing at a gas station counter with a declined card, and nobody else in line was moving. The following 6 weeks were, professionally, the worst of my time at Mercy Valley. Director Caldwell had begun what I can only describe as a documentation campaign. Every deviation from protocol, however minor, was noted. A late chart entry. I had been with a patient who had become acutely distressed and charting was delayed by 20 minutes, was logged. A medication administration that I had adjusted timing on, with the verbal approval of the attending physician, was flagged because the order hadn't been formally updated in the system before I acted. 2 of my colleagues came to me privately and told me they'd been asked by Caldwell whether they had concerns about my practice. Both of them, to their credit, had said no. I started keeping my own documentation. Emails I sent myself with timestamps, notes in a personal file I kept at home. I don't know if I thought I would ever need them. I think I just needed to feel like I was doing something, because doing nothing while something this systematic unfolds around you has a particular psychological weight that is difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. It feels like being slowly made to doubt whether you are the person you believe yourself to be. I thought about leaving. I am being honest about that. I pulled up job listings twice. I had a conversation with a friend who was a nurse in Denver who told me the system out there was not perfect, but it was better. I had a conversation with my mother who told me to trust my gut the way she always does. What I did not do was quit. Partly because Mr. Okafor was still in the building, recovering, and I still felt responsible for him in the way that you do when you've been someone's nurse in a real moment. Partly because there were 11 other patients on my caseload who I knew well and who knew me. And partly because there is something in me, and I am not sure it is always a virtue, that does not leave a room when it is being pushed. I went to work. I documented everything. I was impeccable. Then on a Tuesday morning in late April, I got a message from our unit secretary telling me that I had a meeting with the chief nursing officer at 2 o'clock that afternoon. I want to tell you what that felt like. The chief nursing officer at Mercy Valley Medical Center was a woman named Dr. True. Sandra Osei, who had been in that role for 11 years and before that had been a floor nurse for 16. She was the kind of leader that people in nursing tell stories about the way people in other professions tell stories about mentors. Not because she was particularly warm or effusive, but because she was scrupulously fair and she had a memory like a filing system and she did not waste your time. Being called to a meeting with her without explanation was not a comfortable feeling. I spent the 2 hours before the meeting reviewing my recent documentation. I thought about the personnel note from February. I thought about the medication timing flag. I thought about what I would say if I was being formally disciplined, and I thought about what I would say if I was being let go, and I thought about whether 4 years of genuinely excellent patient outcomes would be enough to stand on. I knocked on her office door at 2 o'clock exactly. She told me to come in, and there he was. He was sitting in the chair to the left of her desk, and he was wearing a suit the color of slate gray, and he looked exactly like himself except that the worn, dark jacket was gone, and everything about the way he occupied the space was different from the man at the gas station counter. Not because he was trying to look different, because he wasn't trying to hide anymore. I stopped just inside the door. He looked at me and smiled, not a big smile, the quiet kind. "I thought that might be you," he said. "When Sandra described you, I was fairly certain." "Doctor described you, I was fairly certain." Osei looked at me with an expression that told me nothing and everything simultaneously. "Rachel, I'd like you to meet Mr. Gerald Harmon. He's the chairman of the Harmon Health Network." The Harmon Health Network owned Mercy Valley Medical Center. It owned 6 other hospitals in Ohio and 2 in Indiana. Gerald Harmon had founded it 32 years ago as a single community clinic in Dayton and had built it into one of the largest regional health networks in the Midwest. His name was on the building across the street, which housed the network's administrative offices. His name was on the scholarship fund that had paid for 2 of my colleagues' advanced degrees. He was the man whose blueberry muffin I had bought at a Shell station for $4 and some change on a Saturday morning in March. I don't remember exactly what I said in that moment. Something inadequate, probably. Something like, "It's nice to meet you," that made no real account of how strange and complete the situation was. He asked me to sit down, which I did. What followed was not what I expected. It was not a dramatic confrontation. It was not a scene. It was a conversation. The kind that is direct without being unkind and thorough without being cruel. He told me that he made a practice several times a year of visiting facilities in the network without announcement, not to catch people in failures. His words? He said he had learned years ago that the picture you get from a scheduled inspection is almost entirely useless because people perform for scheduled inspections. What he wanted to know was what the place actually was, how staff talked to each other in the hallway, whether the person at the front desk looked at the patient or the computer screen, whether the nurses on the floor seemed like people who were supported or people who were enduring. He wore ordinary clothes. He carried a declined card as his default because a declined card, he said, told you more about a place in 30 seconds than an hour of observation. He watched who looked away and who stepped forward. He had been at the Shell station because it was 2 blocks from Mercy Valley, and he had gotten there early and wanted coffee before he walked over. He had spent the rest of that Saturday moving through the building. He had spoken to patients in the waiting room. He had observed 2 shift handoffs. He had watched from the family consultation area how a nurse handled a situation with a distressed daughter whose father had just received a difficult diagnosis. That nurse had been me. I had not seen him. I had been entirely absorbed in the conversation with the daughter, a woman in her 50s named Patricia whose father had just been told his ejection fraction put him in a category that was going to require significant lifestyle changes and possibly intervention. Patricia had been trying to hold herself together in the way that people do when they have been the strong one in the family for so long that falling apart feels like a failure. I had sat with her for 22 minutes. I had not rushed her toward resolution. I had just stayed. He had watched the whole thing. He had also, in the weeks since, asked Dr. Osei to pull my personnel file and review my patient outcome records, and he had asked her to look carefully at the pattern of documentation that had accumulated there in recent months. Dr. Osei had looked carefully. She was, as I said, the kind of leader who notices things. She spoke then, and she was precise the way she always is. She said that the formal note from February had been reviewed and would be removed from my file because the clinical decision I had made in escalating Mr. Brer Okafor's care had been sound and the outcome had confirmed it. She said that the medication timing flag had been reviewed in context, including the verbal approval from the attending, and that it did not constitute a violation warranting documentation. She said that a broader review of the pattern of notes in my file over the past 8 months had been initiated, and that the individual responsible for that pattern had been placed on administrative review pending that process. She did not say Director Caldwell's name. She didn't need to. I sat in that chair and I kept my face still the way I'd learned to, and I felt something in my chest do something complicated and quiet that I still don't entirely have words for. Not triumph. It wasn't that. Something more like the feeling you get when you've been holding your breath for a very long time and you finally remember you're allowed to stop. Mr. Harmon spoke again. He said that what I'd done at the gas station was not the reason for the review. He was clear about that, and I believed him. The review had been triggered by his observations at the facility that Saturday. The gas station was just how he'd known which name to ask about first. But I want to say something about it anyway, he said. Because it matters to me. He said that he had been running a health network for 3 decades and that the thing he had come to believe most firmly about healthcare was that the quality of care a patient receives is inseparable from the quality of the environment the caregiver inhabits. That you cannot ask people to show up with their whole selves for patients if the institution treats them as expendable, and that you cannot build that kind of institution by hiring the right people on paper. You build it by watching what people do when nobody is watching. He said, "You didn't know who I was. You didn't expect anything. You just didn't want an old man to stand at a counter feeling embarrassed over a cup of coffee." He said that was the thing. That was exactly it, not the grand gesture. The small one. The one that costs you almost nothing and that you do anyway because it simply doesn't occur to you not to. I didn't know what to say to that either, so I just nodded and hoped my expression conveyed something true. Before I left the office, Dr. Osei told me that she would be in touch in the coming weeks about some changes on the unit. She said she had been wanting to revisit the discharge planning process and that she'd been told I had submitted a proposal some months ago that deserved a proper look. I walked out of her office and down the hallway and I went to the break room because I needed 30 seconds alone before I went back to the floor. I sat down at the table and I looked at my hands and I thought about my mother, who had taught me to pay for the person behind her in the drive-thru. I thought about Mr. Okafor, who was home now, doing cardiac rehab, who had sent a card to the unit that was taped to the wall near the nurse's station. I thought about Patricia and her father, and the 22 minutes in the family consultation room that I had not been watching the clock during because the clock wasn't the point. I thought about how many times in the past 8 months I had wondered whether being the person I was trying to be was worth it, in a place that seemed determined to make it not worth it. And I thought about the fact that it had always been worth it, not because it had led to this room, not because Gerald Harmon had happened to be standing at a gas station counter, but because Mr. Okafor was home. Because Patricia had not been alone in that room. Because the work itself, underneath all of it, had still been the work. The institutional vindication was real, and I will not pretend it didn't matter to me. It mattered enormously. 4 years of doing your job well should matter. Being treated fairly should matter. But the thing I kept coming back to, sitting in that break room for my 30 seconds, was simpler than any of that. I had bought a stranger a cup of coffee because it was the right thing to do. And somewhere in the same morning I had sat with a frightened woman for 22 minutes because she needed someone to stay. Neither of those things had anything to do with what I might get back. That's the only way they work. The moment you do them with an eye toward the return, they become something else entirely, something smaller and more calculated, something that can't do what those things are actually designed to do. The Marine Corps teaches you a lot of things. The story I'd heard once about a soldier and a general ended, "I'm not a Marine." But nursing taught me something similar, I think. It taught me that the person in front of you is always worth your full attention, whatever stars they're wearing or not wearing, whatever card just declined, at whatever counter, whatever their chart says or doesn't say about who they are. It taught me that dignity is not a reward, it's where you start. I went back to the floor. I had 4 patients waiting. The afternoon stretched out ahead of me, long and full and necessary, exactly the way I had always wanted it to be.